Welcome to this week's webinar. I am joined by the amazing Eleanor Martin, who is the Director of Training and Development at Adjust. And today we're going to be digging into neurodiversity and how you can bring neuroinclusive learning into organizations. So I'm Kim, L&D Free Spirits founder. I'll be looking after the chat. If you've got any questions or need anything, just bob it in there for me. Okay.
Thanks, Kim. I'm Eleanor. Kim mentioned you've seen my bio, so I'm not going to do a long introduction, but basically, I've been working in the area of learning development, HR, recruitment careers for 20 years, and 10 of those years have been neurodiversity specific. A lot of experience in this field, which is relatively new. I'd like to, because there are only a few of us today, it's a nice intimate session. If possible, it'd be great to have an interactive session, but also if you don't want to interact, feel free to turn your camera off, turn your mic off, and I won't call on you. But if you're happy to share, it'd be great if you could introduce yourself, say why you came along, and also any prior knowledge you've got of neurodiversity.
I'll go on, I'll break the ice. So Viv, digital learning consultant, mainly interested in just keeping sort of up to date with developments in L&D. Increasingly, stakeholders are talking about neurodiversity, and I'm conscious it's an area that I don't have masses of background in. So just wanted to get a few pointers and possibly also, if I need to go deeper, understand how I can find more information.
Great. Thanks, Viv.
Hi, I'm Andy. I'm a plain speaking learning consultant. Kind of the same as Viv, really. I know I'm neurodivergent. I know I've got traits, and I've kind of discovered them and focused on them over the last 5 years, turning them into my superpower. Yeah, just keen to learn more and to learn where to go to find out even more.
Great. Okay, thanks so much. So yeah, because this is a nice intimate session, then as I'm going through, if you've got any questions, ask any questions. If you've got any examples from your own experience or from family experience or any kind of experience that you've had or seen, please feel free to share those, because I think often then it can really bring the training to life. So but there's, again, no pressure to, and if you don't want to, if you're not comfortable with that, then you don't need to. So yes, but if possible, then it'd be great if you can interact, and also then we can kind of tailor the session for you guys and make sure that you're getting the most out of the session. I'm Eleanor. I'm one of the directors here at Adjust, and we provide clear and practical training. So our founder, Daniel, set up Adjust 10 years ago. And actually 10 years ago, neurodiversity, very few people talked about neurodiversity, unless maybe you're in that neurodiverse world. So we've come quite a long way in that time, and we're quite established in this field. The big thing that Daniel wanted to do when he set up Adjust was to make the training really accessible, because at the time there was a lot of training that was quite kind of academic based or based on kind of the psychological profiles. And actually what he wanted to do was really bring it to life. And he said, if we do a lot of lunch and learn kind of 1 hour training sessions to companies. And his idea was everyone in the company should be able to come to this session. So the CEO, people working on the front line, people working in security, people working in middle management, everyone should be able to come along and leave with a clear understanding of neurodiversity, and also practical, so how to apply it to their role. We've worked with lots of different organisations, and the reason why I wanted to put this on was not just to show off, but partly to show off, but also to say that neurodiversity goes across all sectors. So I think some people still have this idea that there's a really high prevalence of neurodiversity within tech. That might be true, but also neurodiversity, it goes across all sectors. It's important for all industries. It might be something that's more prevalent in some companies than others, but actually in every industry and in every organisation, we think we should be considering neurodiversity. So the session today is going to be 1 hour. We'll share the slides with you. So you're welcome to take notes, but you will get the slides as well. You can have your camera on or off, and like we said, the interaction is completely optional. And no question is a silly question. You can ask anything, and if you we're not precious about language, so if you want to ask a question but you're not sure you're describing neurodiversity in quite the right way or using a term in the right way, please just ask the question. It's more important that you get your questions answered than it is that we're exactly perfect. So this is a safe space to ask those questions. So the key things that we're going to be looking at is what is neurodiversity and the value of difference. I'm really aware when we're doing these sessions that everyone who comes has got kind of different levels of knowledge around neurodiversity. So for some of you, it might be a bit of a recap rather than fresh learning, but hopefully it's useful to reflect on that. What is neurodiversity? Think about how learning and development can drive neuroinclusion. And then also think about how you can use this practically in your work, as well as how you can pitch neuroinclusive learning to clients. So if you're then or to stakeholders. So this is our definition of neurodiversity, the concept that we recognize, value, and celebrate that we all think differently. And the reason why we've got a cactus on this slide is because we talk about neurodiversity in the same way as biodiversity. So if you've got a cactus growing in the desert, that cactus can be doing really well, getting really big, thriving. If you move that cactus to my back garden in London, it will wilt, it will get very soggy, it will go really brown. We don't say there's something wrong with that cactus or that cactus is defective or deficient. We say that cactus is not in the right environment. And that's how we think about with neurodiversity, is actually in the right environment, in the right context, and someone can thrive. And we talk to organizations a lot about how can they create that context where neurodivergent people can thrive. We also talk about we also do the comparison with biodiversity with if you think about an ecosystem, you might have birds and bees and trees and flowers, and everyone accepts that every organism or every animal, every creature is different and is doing a different job. And the bees don't say to the trees, why are you standing so still? Why are you not moving around? And the trees don't say to the bees, why are you buzzing all the time? And why are you going from flower to flower? It's really accepted that within an ecosystem, everything has its different role, everything does different things, and then that's when the ecosystem can thrive. And we think the same with neurodiversity as well, that actually it's about acceptance that we all think differently. And actually within that, if we have a human ecosystem where we accept that, then actually that's when organizations can thrive. So neurodiversity covers lots of different neurotypes and skills profiles, and we've listed some of them here. Has anyone got any questions? We're going to talk a bit more detail about autism, dyslexia, and ADHD. Has anyone got any other questions around neurodiversity or around the other neurotypes? All good. So this is an overlap between mental health and neurodiversity, and the key reason why we've got this nice diagram is because we know that within neurodiversity, co-occurrence is the norm and not the exception. So it's much more common that someone has 2 or 3 neurotypes than they just have one alone. And that's something that's only recently kind of been discovered. And actually, what that means is that you've probably got a lot of people who've been diagnosed with one neurotype and actually then wouldn't have got diagnosed with something else. So there's a really high co-occurrence between ADHD and autism. And actually a lot of people might have got an ADHD diagnosis or an autism diagnosis, and then their behaviors and their difficulties would have been put down to that one diagnosis. So it's really worth bearing in mind that if you're talking to a neurodivergent learner or talking about neurodiversity, to think about neurodiversity as a whole, because someone in the 2000s at university might have been diagnosed with dyslexia, but actually their disability service at the university wasn't looking for ADHD, and actually that person might be ADHD. So that's why we train about neurodiversity as a whole, is to think about these neurotypes are different, but also if someone has been diagnosed with one neurotype, they might also have another one that hasn't been diagnosed. And so it's worth thinking about neurodiversity as a whole rather than specific conditions. The other thing to point out on this one is mental health. So mental health is different from neurodiversity, but what we find is for a lot of neurodivergent people, they can have poor mental health because they're living in a world that's not neuroinclusive, and they've grown up in a world that's not neuroinclusive. And we especially see this for people who are late diagnosed. So what we see is actually that if children are diagnosed earlier, their mental health outcomes are much better because from an early age, they've got better understanding themselves, better understanding of their skills profile. There'll still be difficulties, but that late diagnosis and actually getting to an older age, not understanding yourself, not other people not understanding you, living in a world that doesn't fit, then that can cause a lot of mental health difficulties. And we see such a big interaction and overlap. And what we like for some autistic people, they might find that if their anxiety is very high, then that makes them more gives them more difficulties around autism. So their sensory sensitivities might be higher if their anxiety is higher. And that's why we talk a lot about context and environment, because if the context and environment is right, then the anxiety will be lower and then difficulties will be less. So the current diagnosed stats is 1 in 5 of your workplace is neurodivergent. Now, actually, we know this is underestimation because a lot of people aren't diagnosed. The King's College last month did a study that said over the age of 40, only 10% of autistic adults are diagnosed. So 90% of autistic adults over the age of 40 are undiagnosed. Also now we get there's a lot more prevalent people self-identifying as neurodivergent and either just not needing a formal diagnosis, not feeling like they need a formal diagnosis, or because waiting lists are so long and it's so difficult to get a diagnosis, they may not go forward and get a diagnosis, and then that person wouldn't be included in this stat. So the official stats are 1 in 5, but it's worth being aware that it's more. And a recent study said that 53% of Gen Z identify as neurodivergent. So especially amongst the younger generation who've been in education when there's been a much better understanding of neurodiversity, there's a much higher prevalence of neurodiversity that has been diagnosed. So we're going to start off with, I guess here, we're going to talk about dyslexia. And one of the ways that we want to kind of bring this to life is by talking about people and talking about their skills and attributes. So which person with, this is interactive activity, so let me know what you think. Which person with dyslexia said, at school, I struggled. I didn't understand it then, but I was and still am severely dyslexic. I knew I was smart, but no one else could see it. It's been my different way of thinking that's been the key to my success. And the clue is a fragrant entrepreneur. Any ideas? No.
Is it Joe
Biff?
Malone?
Kim, any ideas?
What was that? Was that Joe Malone that you said, Emma?
Yeah.
Joe Malone.
Is it
That's
Joe
right.
Malone?
Yeah. So it's Joe Malone. So if you, I don't know if you know Jo Malone, but she has a brand that sells very, very expensive candles and perfumes, candles for like 50 quid. Jo Malone is dyslexic. She, in fact, if you want to know more, she did a Desert Island Discs. She appeared on Desert Island Discs and she talked a lot about her journey and her entrepreneurship journey and also about her dyslexia. Dyslexia is really common amongst, and neurodiversity generally really common amongst entrepreneurs. Because entrepreneurs need to be risk takers, they need to think outside the box, they need to be not held back by kind of societal pressure that says, you know, you should go and work in HR and stay there your whole life. Entrepreneurs are much more likely to be neurodivergent, and actually a lot of the attributes of a successful entrepreneur really align with the dyslexic skills profile. Also, Jo Malone has, one of the things we talk about with neurodiversity is sensory sensitivities. So Jo Malone is hypersensitive to smell. So she has like a really good sense of smell. And this is then why she was able to build this brand, which is all about creating different scents and different candles. And I think it's a really good example because often when people talk about sensory, they think about the negatives and they think about, you know, someone not being able to work in an office with bright lights or with noise. Actually, sensory can be a real positive, a real strength, and it can be a real source of relaxation, a source of pleasure if it's in the right context and the right profile for that person. So neurodivergent people can be oversensitive or undersensitive, to any of the senses. And actually, for a lot of people, they might not know because that's just their experience of the world and how they experience the world, but worth thinking about. So these are the strengths and challenges of dyslexia. And this is, so everyone with a neurotype is completely individual. So not every dyslexic person is going to have this exact profile, but this is these tend to be the common strengths and challenges. So dyslexic people tend to have really good verbal skills and problem-solving skills. Our founder, Daniel, previously worked in St. George's, part of the University Hospital in London. And what he found was a lot of the physios who were coming to him were dyslexic, because to be a physio, you need to have really good verbal skills to be able to describe things, to be able to interpret people's problems, and also the problem solving. And the other part of it is the 3D thinking. So a lot of dyslexic people have really strong ability to kind of visually see 3D things. And for example, within architecture, there's a really high proportion of dyslexic people because it's this ability to literally be able to visualize something in 3D. And so all of those things were strengths profiles for physiotherapists. So dyslexia was really high within the physiotherapists in the university. Often, like we talked about with entrepreneurs, dyslexic people can be really good at coming up with ideas and thinking outside the box and being creative, and also working with people. On the challenges side, so literacy is like obviously the most famous dyslexic challenge, but dyslexia is not all about reading and writing. That's one of the kind of dyslexia stereotypes. Sometimes the literacy can be connected to the 3D thinking, because if your brain sees things in 3D, then sometimes it can be hard to see things in 2D and actually hard to kind of interpret the words. Working memory is the ability to hold information in your head and process that information. So it's the sort of situation where you go upstairs to get something, you get upstairs and you're like, what was it? Why am I here? What did I come up here to get? That's working memory. That's a working memory issue. And so working memory can be a big issue within dyslexia and within other neurotypes as well. And so for example, one of the adjustments that we always recommend to employers around working memory is to make sure that if you give information to someone verbally, either in a meeting, if you pass them in the corridor and ask them to do something, then you also follow that up in writing. And actually, I trained with our founder last week, and he was talking about how, if you see people writing things down on their hand, that's a working memory issue. That made me feel very old and made me think it's very retro, because now hardly ever do I see people writing things down on their hand. And I think that's a positive about technology, that now we're all carrying around phones or have watches where we can dictate things, where we can set reminders, where we can set alarms. And that's been a massive, massive help for working memory. The other area can be focus. That can be hard to focus on one particular thing, and might have a lot of dyslexic people are much better at kind of bigger picture thinking. Also challenges around planning and organization. And then processing speed is a really interesting one. And this can be in lots of different ways. So for example, I am quite fast at processing written information. I can read it and process it quite quickly, but auditory information takes me a bit longer to process. And again, we kind of all assume that everyone processes at the same speed, but actually everyone processes at very different speeds and in different ways. It's worth being aware of that from an L&D point of view. That's all the ones we've covered. So now, in terms of top tips, so what to kind of take away with you, the key things that we recommend to employers is make sure you follow up in writing. Thinking about technology, there's so much technology that's now available. And also I think this one's really important for L&D, is using visuals. So thinking about how we're presenting information. For some people, their working memory might be much more challenged if it's numerical information compared to if it's pictures. So it's thinking about then how do we present information? So we're going to move on to autism with another Guess Who. So which autistic person says it makes me different, and being different is a gift. It also makes me see things from outside the box. I don't easily fall for lies. I can see through things. And the clue is a climate activist. Has anyone got any ideas?
Viv's got it. He wins a gold star. Greta.
Well done. 2 points. So Greta Thunberg, and this is we like to talk about Greta again for two reasons. So the first one is when I started working at the National Autistic Society nearly 20 years ago, the way you got diagnosed of autism was a difficulty in the area of communication. And with Greta, she's addressed the UN, you know, she's done a lot of public speaking. So in a lot of ways, you wouldn't say she's got difficulty with communication. What we prefer to say is a difference in communication. And one of the things that's difficult for autistic people is unstructured communication. So things like small talk, where there's not very clear rules, it's not very logical, it doesn't really have a point. It's very subtle about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, how long to talk for. That sort of communication is more difficult. Where it's more structured communication, you know what to expect, for example, doing a presentation in front of the UN, then actually that communication difficulty is not there, it's a difference. So that we want to kind of hammer that home about communication. And the other thing that we talk about here is that a lot of autistic people have really strong justice sensitivity, so are really aware of unfairness, and there's a really high proportion of whistleblowers are autistic. And I think a lot of autistic people really drive change within organizations, but also drive social change as well. So it's being able to look outside of the social rules. So within an organization, something might be happening, but everyone else says, well, do you know what? Like, yeah, this is wrong, but actually, you know, everyone else seems all right with it, so I'm just going to go along with it. Whereas the autistic person is more likely to be the whistleblower, or more likely to take the company to tribunal or whatever it might be, and say, no, actually, this is wrong. It doesn't matter what everyone else thinks, this is wrong, and I'm going to do something about this. And I think that's a real positive and a real strength. So talking about the skills, a lot of autistic people are very logical. Again, which is like we talked about in the whistleblowing example, real strength, that the logic is not challenged by the social rules. Very good with detail. So again, like I said, with dyslexia, everyone's an individual, so everyone will have their individual strengths and challenges. I worked with some autistic people who have got amazing attention to detail when it comes to, for example, coding, working within coding and being able to spot a mistake in a massive amount of code. I worked with other autistic people who are also dyslexic and have really poor attention to detail around words and numbers, but are able to walk into a room and notice if a tiny thing has changed or moved or is different. And so that a strength will be good with detail, but it just depends on the individual what context that will be in. Autistic people are often good at problem solving because they're able to think outside of the box, and literally their brains work differently, so approach something in a different way. And also loyal. So on the challenges side, for a lot of autistic people, ambiguity or uncertainty causes anxiety. So if something's not clear or uncertain, then that will cause them a lot of anxiety. And so if you think about a change, if you think about starting a new job, for example, that's a lot of ambiguity and a lot of uncertainty. So then therefore, logically, for the autistic person, if they're in a role that suits them, where the employer is treating them well and they're in the right context, then they wouldn't change jobs. There's no reason to change jobs and bring about that change and the uncertainty and the ambiguity. We talked about a difference in communication. And for a lot of autistic people, they might prefer things in writing over verbal information. And often I think that can be because if we get like an email, you're literally just interpreting kind of the words on the page. Whereas if something's said in person, there's a lot to interpret. There's the non-verbal communication, there's the tone of someone's voice, there's the emphasis of what word they put on something, there's maybe whether their facial expression. All of that can make a difference in terms of the meaning of something, whereas in written communication, that's just not the case. And unwritten rules is my I think the biggest one. Like I think once you start to see some of the unwritten rules within our society, within our workplaces, then you can really see how absurd some of them are. And also you can see that if someone breaks those unwritten rules, as a society in Britain, we don't like it. We're uncomfortable with it. We're unlikely to challenge the person, or we're unlikely to say anything to the person, but maybe we talk to other people about it and we say, oh, did you see this person? They did this thing. And, we attribute negative qualities to it. So we say, oh, that person must be selfish, or that person is not a team player, or they're only thinking about themselves. Whereas actually, maybe they're breaking an unwritten rule that they don't know about or that isn't logical. And so again, thinking about how do we if there are unwritten rules, how do we make those clear, and how do we make clear the impact of breaking those unwritten rules, and how people might perceive it. But I think if you can get your head around this one and think about the unwritten rules, then that really makes a big difference in terms of understanding autism. And the last one is sensory, which we talked about with Joe Malone, but worth bearing in mind then from a learning development point of view in terms of where something's happening. I think one of the brilliant things that happened during COVID was this move to working from home, which I think can be really positive because people can then control their own sensory environment and they can then work or learn in an environment that suits them. If you think about, for example, universities, if you go into a big lecture hall with like over 100 people and sit there while someone's talking at you, is that the best way to learn? For a lot of people, that's not the best way to learn, but until relatively recently, that was kind of the only way to learn in higher education. So it's really positive that there's been some disruption around that since COVID. And our top 3 tips are communicate things clearly and think about the unwritten rules as well, manage change, and also follow through on promises. If you say you're going to do something, then do it. So we're going to move on to ADHD now. So another guess who? Which person with ADHD said focus like a laser and not a flashlight? Any ideas?
I know who I think it is. I'm waiting to see what Viv puts in the chat. Seeing as Viv got no, nothing. Okay, Michael Jordan.
Yes, Michael Jordan. Emma, were you going to say the same thing?
I was, but I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be saying it or putting it in the chat because I joined.
Well, you can do either, but weirdly, because of how I shared my screen, I can't see the chat. So Kim will need to be my chat person. Thanks, Emma. Yes, Michael Jordan. So maybe if you if you're happy to, if you've seen the Michael Jordan documentary, The Last Dance, you could put your hands up. If you haven't seen it, I would really recommend it. I'm not really into basketball and I loved it. Anyway, in this documentary, he talks about a lot of the aspects of ADHD and you can see a lot of the strengths and challenges. So, for example, he was so hyper-focused on becoming the best basketball player of all time. So he put in the hours, he was really dedicated. That was his whole hyper-focus. He also talks about RSD, which is rejection sensitivity dysphoria. He doesn't call it that. But when you know about ADHD, you can see it, that basically he would sometimes almost kind of make up in his head that another player had kind of slated him or said something negative about him to motivate him to play well in that game. So it's almost that he needed that additional motivation to be able to play really well in that game and to be able to perform really well. So he almost kind of created that for himself. Rejection sensitivity dysphoria is associated with ADHD, but it can also, I think, be with any neurotype. And especially if we're thinking that some people might have some neurotypes undiagnosed. And it's that you perceive rejection more readily. So it may be in situations where rejection isn't there, as you perceive it as rejection. And then also when the rejection does happen, you feel it 1,000 times instead of maybe other people feeling it like 50 times. So it's like the strength of the feeling as well. So when we talk about ADHD, we talk about the hyperfocus. So that's a really key part of ADHD. And I think it was a myth for a long time that people with ADHD, it was a problem with being able to focus. Actually, for some people, we again say it's a difference with focus. So for some people, they can really hyperfocus. So for example, they can one of the researchers that I worked with in my job at university would literally go into her room to work. She wouldn't leave to go to the toilet. She wouldn't eat. She wouldn't drink. She was so hyper focused on getting a specific task finished. And that's a real attribute of ADHD, and it can be a real strength. Although, depending on how it's managed, you can achieve amazing things, but also it can learn to big burnout, which is also, so it's also thinking about then how do we manage that hyper focus. A lot of ADHD people are really good speakers. A lot of ADHD people are really are really fast processors, so able to process information really quickly. I think I mentioned that I find verbal information slightly slower to process. So sometimes I find myself in conversation with my ADHD friends where I'm not even getting like by the time I've thought of what to say, they've already moved on to something else and moved on to a different topic. And it's interesting to think from an L&D point of view that if you think about real neurodiversity, you might have some people in the room that are really fast processors and are really bored if you're kind of taking a long time to go over something, but then other people who actually need the time and the space to be able to process. So it's an interesting challenge to think about when we're thinking about being neuro-inclusive. A lot of people are very outcome focused, so will want to know what they're doing and what the outcome will be, and very creative and passionate. In terms of challenges, restless and need for movement. So it used to be that you'd get diagnosed with ADHD or ADD. Now it's that you would, an ADD, very broadly, ADHD was like you needed to move, and ADD was you didn't move, so you might not see the physical restlessness, but in your head you might be kind of a daydreamer. That's a very, very snapshot. Don't quote me on that one. Description. Now you might get diagnosed with inattentive, hyperactive, or combined. It's personally, I mean, I think diagnosis needs a bit of disrupting. I think it's quite old school, but personally, I think for some people, especially if you're late diagnosed, I spoke to someone who was in his 60s that got diagnosed, and he said actually for him, he had to internalize a lot of his physical restlessness because it just wasn't allowed at school. For him, he had to internalize it. So for some people, it might be. So I would think about ADHD as a whole rather than getting stuck into kind of specifics. And think about then for some people, from a learning development point of view, people might need to move to do activities. From a company point of view, we often, like a workplace point of view, we talk about like for some people, then walking meetings is going to be better than just sitting next to them and having a meeting. But just incorporating movement can make a really big difference. Some people really have problems with following routines. And there's interesting when you get crossover with autism and ADHD, which is called ADHD, that then you might have this kind of need for routine, but also this struggling to follow routines. And so in the workplace, we talk about kind of prompting people to follow those routines can be really useful. Planning, which we saw in one of the other ones, is kind of difficulty around planning and organization. So a typical profile in the workplace might be that you have someone who works in sales, who's really good at going and doing the sales meetings and really good at getting the sales, but like never types up any of their notes, never communicates with writes anything down for their colleagues. That's kind of a typical old school ADHD profile. Another challenge is emotion. So we talked about RSD, but ADHD people will likely feel emotions much bigger and display emotions much bigger. And again, if we're thinking about late diagnosed people, it might be that the way we were brought up was to push down our emotions and to not display them, and then actually kind of masking those emotions or holding them in can then take up a lot of energy rather than actually kind of experiencing work or experiencing life. And ADHD comes from a difference in the dopamine receptors in the brain and the norepinephrine receptors in the brain. And what that means is that an ADHD person wouldn't get the same dopamine reward from, for example, following a routine or completing a task. So one of the strategies that sometimes people use are things like building in actual rewards when things are done. Things like, I think online, things like digital badges and all of those kind of things can really help in terms of dopamine rewards. But also the other side of this is that a lot of ADHDers have difficulties in regards to like addiction or in other areas, so because they're seeking that kind of readily available dopamine. So in terms of ADHD, we talk about acceptance of movement. Why should we, in the workplace or in L&D, why should we just sit? Why, like, think outside the box. How can we incorporate movement? Having clear outcomes and timelines, but also really nourish individuality. So for anyone who watched The Last Dance, there's also, I think, another really good example of ADHD is Dennis Rodman. And the manager talks about how he would kind of go off and like fly to Las Vegas and do all these outrageous things, but the manager kind of accepted his difference and he was still then able to play on the team and still able to get the results. But if he'd kind of forced him to be the same as the other players, he wouldn't have been able to kind of keep that talent and have him still on the team. So this is our whistle-stop tour of neurodiversity. So I know Andy and Viv, who were on the call at the start, said they were looking to kind of build their knowledge of neurodiversity. Hopefully the other people on the call as well, this has been useful. So what I want to do now is just have a reflection. So take a moment for reflection. So if you want to turn off your cameras and microphones for a few minutes and think about what are you already doing based on what we went through at the start, what are you already doing well for neurodivergent learners and what could you improve? Okay, so is anyone happy to share their thoughts? So based on neurodiversity, what do you think you're doing well? What you're doing well already, and what could you improve? If you're happy to share, then you could turn your microphone off and talk, or put your hand up.
I have an idea. Well,
Yeah.
people are thinking. So I've kind of done it without even thinking about doing it. Very, very, I mean, I've been in this game forever. And I've always had the idea of I want my training, usually my face-to-face training, to be interactive, to be fun, because nobody likes being sat and talked at. So I've always thought about how can I make it interactive? What activities can we do? Can we get them doing teamwork, individual things, flip charts, matching exercises? Is there a video? Is there an audio? All of these extra things to stop them getting itchy bum syndrome, where they're sat and shuffling and starting to get restless. So I've always been doing that. But I need to make sure that I'm doing it now with purpose rather than just being like, okay, I've been talking for a while, let's give myself a break, or let's throw some interaction in to jazz it up a little bit. I need to be thinking, is this the right interaction? What are the benefits? Could it exclude anybody? So, yeah.
Great. Thanks, Kim. Anyone else? Andy, I saw you got your microphone off.
I did turn my microphone off. I've kind of unintentionally built my business around simplicity and helping my clients really understand stuff. But as I tell people, it's because I have to make it simple for me to understand, and then reflecting it back to my clients. They really appreciate it. And it's just the way my brain works. And I'm also very, very good at helping clients manage change, and I hate change. I hate anything that isn't planned. When I'm doing something, I will run through all the scenarios possible in my head before it happens, and then when something else happens, I kind of go to pieces. So I absolutely detest change, but what that does allow me to do is to put myself in my client's shoes and understand all the challenges they're going to feel by going through change. So I'm very sympathetic, but in my real life, I'm terrible at it.
I really like that idea that you've really, this kind of idea of simplicity, that you've brought it to your work, and it's something that you've needed, but actually then that's a real strength.
It's yeah. The clients have loved the way, and it's really only in the last 5 years that I've suddenly realized that I do it because it's been unintentional. It's just the way I've had to do it, but the clients then love my plain speaking attitude and cutting through all it, because the learning and development world can be a bit of a nightmare for acronyms and methodologies. And yeah, I kind of cut through all that and just tell it like it is. Some clients like that, some don't, but they're not the right clients for me.
Yeah, great. And what we often say is that good practice for neurodivergent people is often just clear and straightforward and good practice for everyone. So, for example, speaking in clear English is important for neurodivergent people, but actually it's important for everyone. Like everyone kind of works better on that level. And I think it's the same when we're thinking about learning and development, that almost having a neurodivergent learner will make your session better because you might need to put in additional adjustments, but actually often those adjustments are just going to be useful for everyone and probably are just good practice to incorporate in all of your sessions.
Often we call it common sense, but
Yeah, although I'm a bit against the term common sense because
yeah, I don't like it now.
I think
Yeah,
it can be one of those things where people are like, oh, this person's got no common sense. But actually, what it means is this person's not good at kind of interpreting what I want being done and doing it for me without any clear instruction. But yes,
absolutely.
and clear practice. Yeah, straightforward. I agree. Great. Anyone else have anything they want to share in terms of like what they're doing well or what they think they're not doing well or what they could do better? Emma?
So I've been, I think the book's upstairs. I'm reading a book, or coaching book, around kind of coaching neurodivergent individuals. So I'm really
Right.
interested in learning more about clean language and kind of how you can use that. And I've been also sort of adapting my meeting booking process for new clients and sort of putting in some language around, what adjustments people might need, either at an initial call or when we're working together, putting that in my sort of ways of working document as well. What else? Yeah, and just sort of thinking, so, whether sort of somebody might want, if they have ADHD, for example, they might want extra reminders of kind of upcoming sessions. But yeah, sort of interesting thinking about what Kim was saying about in-person training as well, and that what might work for one person who kind of needs to get up and move around isn't going to maybe work for someone else who finds kind of interacting and kind of doing those sort of that in-person speaking stuff icky and unpleasant. So yeah, I guess just sort of trying to be a bit more mindful about that broad range of things that people might need.
Yeah, and I really like that idea of like almost it's a lot of it is kind of just adapting your process based on the individual, and that by actually asking in advance, you then know and you can kind of have language around that, and also for people to be able to almost say, okay, this is what I like on, yeah, for my meetings, I'd like extra reminders. Or if I'm coming to a training course, I really don't like sitting still for more than half an hour at a time, and I'm going to need to breaks, or I'm going to need to be moving around, or actually, I don't really like interacting at all. So please leave me out of the interactive activities, or being able to kind of allowing people, creating a safe space, or asking in advance. That's never happened to me. I've never been on a training course where someone's asked me in advance, like, what's your preference in terms of training? What do you like doing? What do you not like doing? Any of that stuff. So having that information in advance, and also, yeah, I like the thing about extra reminders. So yeah, it's thinking about the individual, and that's what I really like is we go, every organization, everyone, we all have our kind of standard ways of doing things and our ways that we like doing things and our way that we've built of doing things. And what can be really good is kind of stepping outside of that and being like, oh, actually, well, I've done that because it's easier for me, but is that person going to get the best out of this by me doing that? Maybe not. And, maybe I can ask them. So yeah, being confident to have that language or asking in advance, I think can be really helpful. Anyone else before we move on?
Just on the back of what you were just saying there, that's actually a really good question to have in a discovery call with the client. What are we doing in this solution? What are we doing for people to make it neuroinclusive? What are we doing for the neurodivergent? Do you want a variation of methods? So if if one person or one part of the end users may not process auditory information very easily, put the transcript in as well so they can choose to listen or they can choose to read. So I
Yeah.
like that as a discovery type question. Because
Yes.
we usually say, how far are we going into it with accessibility, but not neurodivergency?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and asking that sort of specific question, like what adjustments do you put in? How do you kind of optimize your learning for your neurodivergent employees? Like all of those things. Oh, I can see the chat now. So I've noticed that there's some all good people loving the cactus analogy. Yes, I think it's really interesting about COVID and yeah, and I agree. I think a lot of people, it kind of brought it to head. And then also there's been kind of this snowball effect. So when I first worked in neurodiversity, there was kind of very few, this sounds crazy now, but there was very few prominent women who were autistic or ADHD. Like it was very unusual. Whereas, and then that kind of self-perpetuates. So, you know, women think, well, I don't relate to what I'm seeing, so this isn't me. Whereas now there's lots of really great Instagram accounts and of, you know, teenage girls saying I'm autistic and this is what I find difficult. And then you get other girls saying, oh, actually, that's the same as me. And then people more like to seek a diagnosis. So it's kind of a snowball in a really positive way. Oh, and yes, interesting about ADHD during perimenopause. That's a really interesting one as well that I think for a lot of women, they can mask and kind of almost like hold it all together with a lot of extra work. And then sometimes during hormonal changes, whether that's perimenopause, whether that's pregnancy, post-pregnancy, menopause, then the hormones mean you're kind of not able to put all that extra effort into masking anymore, not able to put all that extra kind of legwork into living. And so therefore these kind of problems become much more prevalent. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the slides. I don't know, can you still see the slides? Okay. So we've covered a lot of this, but yeah, thinking about clear language, plain English, we talked about building and processing time, consider sensory needs, and yeah, normalizing accessibility. So asking everyone those questions about, you know, how do you learn best? What's your optimal way of learning, rather than just asking neurodivergent people, ask everyone about that. And also materials in advance. It's interesting because one of the training courses I attended recently, there was a neurodivergent participant, and one of the sessions, there was kind of a word or concept that was new to him, and he said, basically, for me, like everything else goes blank now at this stage. I'm so focused on this bit that I don't understand or don't get, that then I can't take in anything else. And actually for him, having the materials in advance is really helpful, because then he's able to, if there is something he doesn't understand on the materials, he's able to look that up and he's able to familiarize himself with that before he then does the learning. Whereas if it's just on the day, then that can completely destabilize his learning. So it's really interesting to think about. We kind of know why these things are useful, but we don't necessarily recognize the impact of that. And then also to think about on the day as well. So make sure we're using multiple channels, and that we encourage collaboration as an opt-in, checking in regularly, and also as a trainer, or as you know, when you're designing learning, be aware of your triggers as well, that maybe there's certain things that trigger you. So just really be aware of that. So the next part that we're going to talk about is about how to kind of pitch this to companies. So I wanted to use this as an example of how we kind of pitch neurodiversity to companies. But I'd like to do another activity now. And just again, if you turn your camera and your microphone off for a few minutes and just think about how could you pitch neuroinclusion to your clients. Okay, so now based on that activity, any ideas of like how you could put them in the chat, or you could share them of how you could pitch neuroinclusion to your clients?
I've got a slightly different take on this. Who knows what this says about the way my head works? But um, I think with a lot of clients, you don't actually have data in terms of how many people in your organization have got particular conditions or needs. My understanding is that because of data protection rules, that's kind of like personal information. So you wouldn't like have a HR database that said this person's got ADHD, this person's got dyspraxia, and there are 300 people in this business unit who've got this particular neurotype. So from a normal sort of L&D performance consulting kind of stance, you'd be going to your client and saying, how many people have you got? Is this an issue for you? Whereas here it seems like we're very much in a different world of saying the stats of the general population are X. The chances are that your organization is similar. And so I think there's I can imagine that with a lot of clients, there's an awareness raising sort of issue before you even get to the, hey, I can design lots of stuff that will help in this
Yeah.
situation.
It's interesting. So yeah, that's a good idea that you kind of use the general stats rather than some organizations do. But again, a lot of people don't tell their employers, so they're often not representative. So, but yeah, I think what's interesting is in the last 5 years, a lot of organizations have done a lot of neurodiversity training. So it's all maybe that's also another question to ask as well in terms of like how much, what sort of neurodiversity training have you done? How much of this is kind of a focus? Yes, great. Thanks, Kim. Yeah, I just noticed that we've got only a few minutes left. I'm just going to run through the so these are kind of ideas for the value proposition. So why is neuroinclusive learning better? And especially this kind of scalable, future-proof, especially as we know there's a high proportion of Gen Z coming through who are neurodivergent. And then also on the slides, I put some talking points for clients, so ways that you could kind of bring up conversations or phrases that you could use, or just kind of starting points that could be useful. One of the things I just wanted you to think about is if there are any things that you're going to do differently as a result of today, you can just put that in the chat if you can, if you've got any ideas or if you've thought something that you're going to do differently. Hopefully, you're just going to be thinking about things in a different way. This is a book that our founder wrote. He has ADHD and he did a lunch and learn session for a publishing company. And they said, this is amazing. We want to make it into a book. So that became the Pocket Guide to Neurodiversity. And actually during the process of writing, he got diagnosed with ADHD because it was such a challenging process. But the book is great and it's also available on Audible. And this is our feedback survey. So if you are happy to give feedback, then you get a 20% discount on Daniel's book. If you're interested in getting more information. Just to give you context about us at Adjust, we do training for recruiters, managers, HR, and colleagues. And we also do bite-sized courses we do a lot for employee resource groups, so like neurodiversity and parents, a lot about intersection, like neurodiversity and race, neurodiversity and women. But this is kind of a wider context of who we are and what we do. Thank you for taking part and thanks for sharing your experiences.